Hi moms and dads, so this is part 2 of Ruth. Why don't you just read Ruth chapter 3 verse 1 through to chapter 4 verse 22, and would you just note how Naomi's scheming and God's sovereign plan land up coming together. And just some notes is that in order to fully understand and appreciate the cultural practices described in the story, it is necessary for us to understand the two important provisions that were made in the law of God for the nation of Israel. So the one was ownership of property and levirate marriage. So when Israel first occupied the land under Joshua, each tribe was apportioned a piece of land. So this was to be their inheritance and it could never be lost. So the law of God, already given through Moses, made provision to ensure that no one could lose their inheritance, no matter how poor they became. Levirate marriage was a way of ensuring that even if a man died, that his family was not left without property and that his family line could be continued. So in the book of Ruth, both of these important principles land up coming together to secure a hope and a future for Naomi and Ruth, who were now both widows. So have a look at chapter 3, verse 1 to 6. This may seem presumptuous, but Naomi knew that God's law made it possible for women in their position to be redeemed. Boaz had been very gracious up until this point, but Naomi urged Ruth to push him towards marriage. This was their only means of being able to secure their future. It still took courage on Ruth's part, because Boaz was not actually the only close relative, and therefore he was not actually obliged to redeem her. So she risked the embarrassment of being refused. Then in verse 7 to 9, threshing floors were high up where the wind could catch and blow away the chaff to separate it from the threshed crop. Boaz had settled down at the far end for the night, and he was startled to find Ruth there when he awoke. She had uncovered his feet and had lain there, and that was a sign of submission. He didn't recognize her in the dark, and this would have been a very awkward situation. She then invited him to spread his garment over her and be her kinsman redeemer by marrying her. Then verse 10 to 15, Boaz was flattered that a young woman would want to marry such an older man, but he realized that she was doing this for Naomi's sake. It could have gone either way for Ruth at this point, but Boaz quickly put her at rest. He reassured her that the townspeople would not object because they knew that she had integrity, but that there was another closer relative who was obliged to redeem her first. So Boaz promised that the situation would be resolved that day, one way or the other. He was concerned for her safety, so he insisted that she stay with him until morning, but leave early enough that she would not be recognized in order to preserve her reputation and his own. Then verse 16 to 18, Naomi must have seen the large gift that Ruth was carrying and been encouraged that the meeting had gone well. She in turn assured Ruth that it would be settled that day. Then over into chapter 4, the city gate, verse 1 to 10. The city gate was a place where business and legal matters were conducted. Boaz could be sure that Naomi's close relative would walk through this way so that he could put the matter to him. The closer relative, he declined because he did not want to put his own property at risk through the marriage. And so Boaz therefore took on this costly role himself. The transfer was legalized by the elders, the witnesses, and the exchanging of a sandal. That was a sign that the deal was complete. How simple life was back in those days, right? Then chapter 4, verse 11 to 12. The prayer of the witnesses present was for Boaz to be rewarded with many children for what he had done. Clear evidence of God's blessing. The stories recall an even earlier and less honorable example of levirate marriage, which was Tamar and Judah, that had taken place in the same region. That's in Genesis 38 if you want to read that. And then verse 13 to 22, the book closes with the prayers of Naomi, Ruth, and the witnesses having been answered. Naomi had been renewed and restored. Ruth had been redeemed and blessed. And the family line grew to include King David himself. Not even the author of Ruth, however, could imagine that God would use this line to produce a greater redeemer for the whole world, which we know is Jesus. As we just think through this passage as parents, would you reflect on how does the story of Ruth as a whole not only show God's concern for our immediate needs, but also for our eternal destiny? How is this true for Ruth and Naomi? And how is this true for you? And then secondly, how are God's purposes for the whole world achieved through the everyday actions of ordinary people, simply living in obedience to God's word? How does this encourage you in your daily commitments to walk in faith and obedience? And then lastly, will you give thanks for Jesus and ask that God would use your everyday actions to carry out his plans to redeem the world through his Son? What a great prayer that is. What a great goal that is for each of us for our lives. Have a wonderful time on Sunday. And I pray that as you look at this study and as your children see the link between Boaz as the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and Naomi, and they are amazed at how God provided, that they too would see the great provision of Jesus from God for each one of us to redeem us.